Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for coming to your seats. So glad to have you with us. On behalf of the Collegium Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture, as well as the Penn Newman Center, it's my privilege to welcome you here to our annual Newman Lecture. I'm Dan Cheely, and I'm grateful to direct the Collegium Institute, which draws our country's first secular university here, the University of Pennsylvania, into conversation with the Catholic tradition, as well as with the Catholic or universal questions that should animate all thoughtful life. It's always a privilege to work together with the Penn Newman Center, and especially so on the occasion of Newman's 224th birthday. So many of us here know that this is the original home of the Newman movement in America, and we thank the Penn Newman Center for their collaboration in helping Collegium through this annual lecture series to reclaim the legacy of John Henry Newman in our own university community and beyond. Tonight's lecture, "To Live is to Change, Newman on Growing Up Well," is the 11th annual Newman Lecture. It may be the first, however, to engage with Newman's thinking on psychology. That's better. Actually, it works better if I speak into the microphone, right? Yes. Okay. I won't redo the opening. But I'm particularly excited about tonight's topic because Penn, I already mentioned, is the home of the Newman movement in America. It is also the home, the birthplace, the guiding star of the positive psychology movement. And so I'm so pleased to consider Newman on the matter tonight. Our prior Newman lectures have featured many great luminaries. I'll name just a few. So the late Don Briel, who is really the founder and architect of Catholic studies programs in America. Thomas Fowle, a magnificent scholar of literature and theology at Duke University. John Garvey, the former president of Catholic University of America. Eamon Duffy, perhaps the most famous living Catholic historian in the Anglophone world. Helena Tomko, professor of Villanova's wonderful humanities department, who is here with us tonight. And most recently, Professor David O'Connor of the University of Notre Dame. We publish these lectures every year, and we brought with us copies of Professor O'Connor's lecture from last year, Newman, Tolkien, and the Perils of Beauty. So if you haven't read it yet, please consider doing yourself a favor and picking up one of the remaining copies before you leave. So tonight's format is pretty straightforward. Our distinguished speaker will have the floor for a half hour, after which he has generously agreed to another half hour or so of Q&A. Depends on how good the questions are, right? And if you have more, please feel free to continue discussing the lecture with him or with the rest of us during our dessert reception/birthday party immediately following the lecture. And there's plenty of seats up front. Yeah, you're most welcome to come right up. Yeah. Welcome Villanova. Thank you for coming. Now to introduce our speaker. So Thomas Hibbs is the J. Newton Razor Senior Professor of Philosophy and Dean Emeritus at Baylor University, where he was also the inaugural Dean of the Honors College and the founding director of Baylor in Washington. Professor Hibbs comes to us all the way from Texas, where he also had served as president of the University of Dallas. In addition, he has served as president of the American Catholic Philosophical Association. His research and teaching focus on medieval philosophy, contemporary virtue ethics, which is another keen interest of the Collegium Institute with the Anscombe archive here at Penn, as well as aesthetics. He's published 8 books, the most recent of which is Theology of Creation, Ecology, Art, and Laudato Si. He has published also more than 100 articles on film, theater, art, and higher education in a variety of venues ranging from the Chronicle of Higher Education to the Wall Street Journal. And it's actually through his film criticism that I first encountered him. Through his book, Shows About Nothing, Nihilism in Popular Culture from The Exorcist to Seinfeld. And for that reason, we almost asked him to make his lecture about Newman on pop culture. Maybe another time, Tom. But I believe he's got about a dozen different directions he can go in with Newman. And after tonight, for tonight, we're thrilled to hear what he has to say about Newman on growing up well. So please join me in welcoming Professor Thomas Hibbs.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here. I've admired the work of Collegium and the Newman Center here for quite some time. It's remarkable to me the breadth of the types of projects that are being run here. Although, Dan, after hearing that list of previous speakers, I'm sorry that the Collegium has fallen on such hard times. Many of those people are people I greatly admire. Some of them are friends. It's a real honor to be here and to be able to talk about Newman. And I've spent time talking about Newman, and maybe more of this can come out in the question period. I spent time reading and thinking and writing about Newman as a philosopher and as a college administrator. I spent over 20 years as a chair, dean, and then president. Did a lot of thinking about Newman when I was at administration. And through it all, I've thought about Newman regularly and continue to when I think about the formation of our undergraduate students. And so what I have to say tonight touches upon all of those areas. But I want to talk about Newman's idea of development and growth. I want to begin, though, just by picking a few highlights from a short story that James Joyce wrote. It's in Dubliners, called Evelyn. Evelyn is 19. She is sitting as evening sets and the dust is surrounding her in the house that she's trying to take care of for her mother who has died. She's 19 years old. She's taking care of 2 younger siblings. Her father is both a drunk and an abuser, and it's getting worse, we know from the beginning of this. She has met a young man named Frank who wants to take her off to Argentina, wants to marry her and take her off to Argentina and give her the life that she never imagined she could have. I'm going to give away the ending of this short story. They're all worth reading. But she ends up going to the boat in Dublin to meet him, and they get separated. And all the while, she's feeling the pull between the duties of her current life and the habits she's developed there and this new adventure. There's a sense in the story that the adventure she might be pretty naive about Frank and what might happen on this trip. But she ends up, as he makes it onto the boat, she ends up clutching the railing, paralyzed and unable to move. Her hand, Joyce wrote, clutched the iron railing in frenzy like a helpless animal. Amid the seas, she sent out a cry of anguish and looked at him without love or affection or any emotion whatsoever. Joyce's Dubliners, the last one, The Dead, which is the most famous, he wrote after being abroad for a few years. He gives a somewhat more sympathetic read of his fellow Irish in Dublin in that one. But all of his stories in Dubliners are about paralysis. They're about the inability for people living in Dublin to grow or to develop. And it really doesn't matter whether you're single or married, whether you're young or old, whether you're an alcoholic or a teetotaler. Dublin gets every one of them and traps them. Evelyn is caught between old and new, past or present on the one hand and future on the other. Between duty to her family, she made a promise to her mother that she would stay and help raise the younger children. Between duty on the one hand and happiness. She's also psychologically caught between stasis and adventure. And more deeply, between resignation or despair and hope. She's deeply conflicted from beginning to end of this story. We all experience conflicts in the stories that we've inherited. That great line from Lord of the Rings when Sam says to Frodo, "I wonder what story we've fallen into." One of the most important things at various stages, I think especially for college students, to determine, but it's true for all of us at every stage. What stories are we part of? And what's our role in them? How do we want to respond to those stories? Young people inherit stories that are conflicting about aspirations for success, money, and advancement on the one hand, and perhaps morality, friendship, family, church on the other. Conventional accounts of success versus a deep sense of calling. The conflict between an aspiration for marriage, family, and children on the one hand, and individual growth and expression on the other. These are conflicts between stories. Some of the more interesting conflicts about stories are when individuals, and most of our great quest stories are like this, when individuals find themselves in one story that opens up into a higher and more demanding story. So you go through the wardrobe with C.S. Lewis and you find yourself in a story that envelops the story that's outside of the wardrobe. When you're asked to leave the Shire and have to give up second and third breakfast and whatever it is that they're smoking every night in the Shire because you're called to do something that will save Middle Earth. There's one story being caught up with and within and in conflict with a smaller story. We all have conflicts between different spheres of our life from day to day: career, family, friendship, church. Too much emphasis on one aspect of the story to the detriment of another can be harmful. The failure to acknowledge that we're living with conflicts in inherited stories can be problematic. There is a lot. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on the resonances I see with contemporary psychology, but going all the way back to the early post-Freudian psychologists like Erikson, describing stages of human development in terms of key conflicts at various stages, and the question is whether those conflicts are resolved or not. Erikson, for the teenage years, sees a conflict between the formation of identity and remaining in confusion. For people my age and older, he sees a potential tension between integration or despair, with wisdom as what we're aiming for late in life. We can all be grateful if the conflicts that we experience come at the right time. The thing is, you can't plan for them to come at the right time. For years, I would do recruitment events at Baylor with very high-achieving students who were applicants, been accepted to our honors college. And when they would ask questions of faculty, all of the questions almost would be versions of, how do I come here and succeed? And at a certain point, I would interrupt the faculty conversation and say, you know, one of the things you're going to have to do is you're going to have to fail your first year, because you will fail at something, maybe not academically, maybe in your social life, maybe in a romantic relationship, whatever it might be. You're going to have to fail and recover from that. And I could see their little minds working, saying, October 12th, this fall, I will fail, and by the 14th, I will have recovered from that. But of course, that's not how the most challenging conflicts and failures come at us. They come at us when we don't see them coming and hit us like a truck. And then we have to find out if we have the resources. Conflicts at the right time are when we actually have time to respond to them and also have the resources. So being aware of what resources we have in terms of our own history, things we have not drawn upon that are actually there latent within our souls because of the kinds of formation we've had intellectually, morally, communally, and religiously. Resources in terms of friendships, resources in terms of, and I'll return to this later, examples in our midst of people who have exhibited resilience and put together things that we so often think can't go together in our lives. Newman's own account of cognitive development. This you can find in a number of places. It's there, especially in The Idea of a University, where Newman presents before us a model of education where we pursue knowledge for its own sake in its complexity and its unity. And I think the combination of these for Newman is absolutely crucial for university education and for our own cognitive and moral development. You can go wrong in both directions. If you have too much complexity where nothing fits together, that's a problem. Most of modern education, except in the sciences where we subject students to very rigorous curriculum integrated, most of modern education is a bit of this and a bit of that, and we leave it to students to try to put it all together. That's a dangerous model. But you can also go wrong by having integration come too quickly. If it comes prematurely, you will not be able to expand. In a sense, Evelyn, her integration comes too early. She did not have experiences of moving outside of the very narrow sort of family life that she had in Dublin. And because of that, even at the age of 19, I think Joyce is telling us she's sort of stultified and paralyzed for life. She's not going to be able to develop. So you can go wrong by having things just disparate and unintegrated. You can go wrong by having things integrated superficially and too quickly. Quote from Newman, "We know," this is one of those sentences that if you undergrads wrote this on a paper, your English professor would write run-on sentence in the column, right? This is the kind of thing that Newman could get away with and carry off that we have a very difficult time doing. We know, not by a direct and simple vision, not at a glance, but as it were, by piecemeal and accumulation, by a mental process, by going around an object, by the comparison, the combination, the mutual correction of many partial notions. Such a union and concert of the intellectual powers, such an enlargement, development, such a comprehensiveness is necessarily a matter of training. Newman thinks that our minds, even in our ordinary experiences, reach out for enlargement and comprehensiveness. So we want to be capacious in how we experience the world. Children are constantly asking questions until we take them to school and beat it out of them, if not metaphorically at least, right? This sense that the mind is naturally ordered toward taking in more and more experience, more and more knowledge. But Newman also thinks that we have to make this knowledge our own. This is a really beautiful passage where he talks about digesting our experiences and our knowledge. We have to make the objects of our knowledge subjectively our own and digest what we receive into the substance of our previous state of thought. Living organic knowledge, as Newman puts it here. It affords us a connected view of the old and the new, the past and the present, far and near, and has an insight into the influence of all these on one another, and without which there is no whole and no center. So Newman thinks that the mind is naturally expansive, but the mind cannot be merely passive in just taking in more and more information. It has to be actively digesting the knowledge. And I think Newman is clearly going in this passage beyond anything that an academic training could provide you. This is what goes on when you raise questions as students. How does what I'm learning in this class fit with what I just studied in this other class? How does all of this fit with my friendships? How does it fit with my faith? How does it fit with my career aspirations and my sense of calling? Newman thinks that our minds, if they're operating in a healthy way, are expanding and integrating. It's got to be taken into a center, but that center's always moving because it's in a different place when it has new experiences and takes in new knowledge. In one of his most remarkable sermons, which if you read anything from Newman, this is short. It's a short reading assignment. He gave a sermon on the Feast of St. Monica on the occasion of the opening of the university year when he was rector at University College Dublin. He sees Monica in relation to Augustine as standing in the same relationship that the church does to young minds and souls. The goal of the church, he says, in supporting education is to reunite things that were in the beginning joined together by God and have been rent asunder by man. He's especially concerned, of course, in his time and for university education in a Catholic setting with the supposed inherent opposition between the life of the mind and the life of faith. The assumption, as he puts it, that to be religious, you must be ignorant, and to be intellectual, you must be unbelieving. A common assumption in our culture, even in our churches, right? That if you're seriously religious, about the best your intellect can do is to be operating in neutral. And a lot of people are going to think your intellect is operating in reverse. But Newman's also interested in lots of other ways in which young people can think that things do not come together. He says, as we grow up into adolescence, our souls seek out, the powers of our souls seek out different avenues for their exercise. So we seek out passion, appetite, strength, and material resources, virtue or intellect. But because the world is divided up between human beings who primarily follow duty or pleasure or glory or the intellect, young people are led by the examples that they see as they look out at the world and say, what's my place in it? Where do I belong? What am I drawn to? They're led to think that duty cannot be pleasant, that virtue cannot be intellectual, that goodness cannot be great, that conscientiousness cannot be heroic. In a beautiful line, he says, what happens in adolescence is that young people find developing their souls rival kingdoms: pleasure, career aspiration, friendship, marriage, intellectual life, faith. If they don't resolve these, and especially if they don't resolve these under and within the ambit of faith, then one or another of these dominant passions or aspirations will take over. And as Newman beautifully puts it, they will lose the delight that they used to take in going home. They will no longer come home to God and to the church. Newman thinks that the most important thing about a university education, this is what he says actually is the collegiate mark of the education. The university is great scholars who attract ambitious, bright young people by their brilliance and their learning. But he says if that's all you have, that is an icy, wintry condition for the soul of students. It needs to be complemented by what he calls a collegiate model, which is students living together and also living among faculty, and especially faculty who combine what young people typically see as separated in their communities, especially the life of intellect and the life of faith. Newman says, I want the intellect to range freely. I want faith to be developed robustly. But I also want for young people to have in their midst people who are developing these things freely and in an integrated way in their individual souls. He says oddly at the end of Idea of a University, this great long treatise where he defends the notion that knowledge is an end in itself, that pursuing the truth for its own sake is the goal of university education in its complexity and unity. But then at the end, he turns to St. Philip Neri, who was not an intellectual, not an academic. He was also not someone who spent a lot of time propagating the faith or giving an exposition of doctrine or teaching catechesis. Instead, Newman says, Neri embodied easy conversation. Everyone felt comfortable talking with Neri. And Neri created a home of Christian mirth. What a beautiful phrase. A home of Christian mirth. I connect the end of Newman's Idea of a University, where he talks about Neri, with another sermon that he gave called Personal Influence, the Means of Propagating the Truth. Listen to this sentence. Truth is upheld in the world not as a system, not by books, not by argument, not by the temporal power, but by the personal influence of those who simultaneously are teachers and patterns of virtue, those who live the virtues and can also articulate them. That is the means of propagating the truth, through friendship with holy and intelligent human beings. Newman thinks that there are going to be conflicts, and that's why we need examples, even when we're not yet ready to integrate all the things that are pulling us in different directions. Newman also knows that intellectually we're going to face conflicts. Newman thinks truth cannot be contrary to truth. It's all God's truth, right? The same God who reveals himself in Scripture is the same one who created this vast universe and each of us. There can ultimately be no conflict in what is taught in these various modes by this one God who is himself truth. So truth cannot ultimately conflict with truth. It often seems that truth contradicts truth. There's a wonderful line in Thomas Aquinas where he talks about objections to the faith. And he says, we know that truth cannot ultimately contradict truth. So, whatever objections seem to be valid that are contradicting a truth taught by the faith, it is possible to answer them. I love both the confidence and the humility of Aquinas in that sentence. It is possible. He isn't even saying that he, the most brilliant Catholic philosopher to that point and since, I would argue, has every answer to resolve all these problems. But he is saying we know that they're resolvable, and we don't need to be anxious or defensive about this. And that's the third thing from Newman. Truth cannot ultimately contradict truth. Truth seems to contradict truth. Let's be patient. Let's give ourselves time, and let's keep working at these issues so that over time we see how truths are actually integrative and integrated in our intellectual lives and in our personal lives. Sometimes, when we're expanding and integrated, sometimes in our lives, we experience these as moments of great adventure and challenge, where we are expanding and growing and integrated. At other times, we don't seem to be moving much at all, or we seem to be growing but not integrating. Then there are the times when we're tempted to despair at whether expansion or integration is possible, where things seem fragmentary, where we're troubled by doubts, where we experience what Dorothy Day calls the long loneliness. Newman for all of his optimism about growth and development and expansion and integration, had a lot of periods of long loneliness, even in the midst of friends. We can be lonely even when we have friends. In his early 30s, he was traveling in Sicily and became nearly deathly ill, and was also in a kind of personal crisis. This was right before the Oxford movement would start and Newman's path would veer decisively toward Catholicism. But he wrote this poem or hymn, and I want to end with this. As he was on a boat from Sicily heading back to the mainland of Italy. Lead, kindly light, amid the encircling gloom. Lead thou me on. The night is dark, and I am far from home. Lead thou me on. Keep thou my feet. I do not ask to see the distant scene. One step enough for me. I was not ever thus, nor prayed that thou shouldst lead me on. I loved to choose and see my path, but now lead thou me on. I loved the garish days in spite of fears. Pride ruled my will. Remember not past years. So long thy power hath blessed me, sure it still will lead me on, o'er moor and fen, o'er crag and torrent, till the night is gone, and with the morn those angels' faces smile, which I have loved long since and lost a while. Thank you.